Hello, welcome to our presentation on the topic of sustainable rice production in Mekong data. Our project is going to analyze the effects of rice production in Mekong data by using a dynamic system which will reflect key variables, impacts, and release suggestions. This is our methods. All of our data are based on researches from 1995 till now and predictions from scholars to 2025. With the increasing of global population, more rice is demanded as the world's second largest region for rice cultivation. The Mekong data plays an important role in Vietnam's economy as well as food supply security. However, rice production in Mekong data is seriously affected by variables like climate change, rice plantage, water infrastructure buildings, and rice cropping practice. The first variable from our research is climate change. Climate change may caused by greenhouse gases released by fertilizer and increasing global temperature, which will cause sea level rising and finally result in land loss. It is obvious that more land for rice planting, more rice will people get. To meet the increasing rice demand for world population, farmers in Mekong Delta tend to make more land for rice grazing. Over the past years, our water level of Lower Mekong River has been extremely low in the dry season, while water flow has increased in the wet season, leading to soil erosion in the river. This is a consequence of the construction of dams in the upper part of the Mekong mainstream, mainly to meet the increasing electricity demand in Southeast Asia. Since 1993, more than 60 hydro dams have been completed along the river, and by 2020, there will be over 100 dams operating in the area. Cropping practice and necessary nutrients also play a vital role in rice production. From our research, which already reflected in this graph, can be seen that increasing cropping seasons will increase rice production, while less nutrients will negatively affect the rice production.
The next part is a causal loop diagram. There are three main parts in our causal loop diagram based on three main key variables. The blue one represents for the water infrastructures, the green one represents for the climate change, and the orange one represents for the cropping practice. So we are going to the first part of our causal loop diagram. This is the dam construction impacts or like water infrastructure impacts. Due to high demand for electricity in upper parts of Mekong Delta rivers, people build more dams in these regions, and it affects to inundation barriers and flow velocities. With the flow velocity, it affects to the food bank erosions, and then it affects to cultivated areas and sediment-based nutrients available, and for inundation barriers, it finally affects to the sediment-sparse nutrients available. And this is the second part of our causal loop diagram is climate change impacts. And as you can see from the green arrows, so the climate change impacts will affect to temperature, sea level, and from temperature it affects to inundation barriers. And as you discussed from the last part, the inundation barriers will affect to the sediment paths and affect to the flow velocities in the rivers. And for the sea level, when sea levels will affect to the cultivated areas, and it also increase the sun water intrusion, and therefore it's affect back to the flow velocities and also affect to the water and soil qualities. And we are going to the last part of our causal loop diagram is the environmental aspects. And as you can see from the graph, there are three main factors in this causal loop. The first one is the annual yield, the second one is the cropping seasons, and the last one is fertilizer applies. For the annual yields, the annual yield have the positive impact on the economic profits, and the economic profits will have positive impacts on cropping seasons. The cropping seasons will have negative impacts on total nutrients available, and the nutrients available will have positive for impact on annual yields. On the other side, the cropping seasons will have positive impacts on the fertilizer applies, and the fertilizer apply will have positive impacts for the total nutrients available, and therefore it have positive impacts on the annual yields. And there are two main types of system archetypes in our causal loop diagrams. The first one is the limits to growth, and as you can see from the slide, we have two main loops in here. The first loop is the reinforcement loop. From cropping season will lead to partly available, lead to yield harvest and profits. However, we have limit in nutrients available, therefore it creates unbalancing loop to the partly availables. And also people build more dam in the Mekong Delta River, so it have negative impact on irrigation barriers, and therefore it also have negative impacts on the nutrients availables. And the second archetype in this causal loop diagram is a fixed that fails to reduce the impacts of nutrients available. People decide to apply more fertilizer as the increasing cropping seasons, and it makes the reinforcement loop in here to make people can have more nutrients available, and therefore they can have more paddy available, and therefore they can have more profits. However, as they increase the cropping seasons, it increases the fertilizer applies, and therefore it also increases the cultivation cost, and it reduces the total profits. And as you can see from the slide, the balancing loop appear in here, and like it reduces the impact from the last reinforcing loop and makes the fix from fertilizer apply failed.
So now let's move on to the system dynamic model for the problem described. The model includes installed capacity of hydropower, cultivated area, yield, sea level above reference level, water level in river basin, and farmer's profit, and these are all modeled with stocks and flows. Also included are effects of sea level rise on river flow, area, and yield, and links between water management constructions, river flow and erosion, as well as links between river flow, availability of natural nutrients, and artificial fertilizers are modeled. And there are furthermore some assumptions done in this model, and these are that the effect of temperature increase, thus global warming, is included in the data for sea level rise. We also assume that the annual inflow to the basin is constant, and that means that the annual rainfall is based on data for mean annual rainfall for the Vietnamese regions of Mekong River Delta. So thus are seasonal changes in rainfall not considered in the model. And furthermore, the yield per hectare is directly proportional to availability of nutrients in the soil, and also availability of nutrients is proportional to flooding factor. And we also assume that costs per unit rice yield and costs per unit of sold rice are constant. Here we have an overview of the stock and flow model. The key feedback loops from the causal loop diagram capturing the stock and flow model are the dependence between hydropower in river system and flood levels, and how that affects area, yield, and economic profit. Also how sea level rise affects the cultivated area, yield, and river discharge as a result of constructions to keep the salt water out of plantations. The links between rainfall, flood levels, availability of nutrients, and yield are also included in the system, and also the impact of cultivation practice on fertilizer use and yield. There are however, some boundaries to the model, because the model is somewhat simplified to not include modeling of population and how change in population changes electricity demand and consumption of rice. The increased electricity demand is assumed to be included in the actual and predicted data for hydropower construction that is found in research papers and governmental documents. Also not taken into considerations are implications of climate change in terms of global warming and greenhouse gas emissions. And here we see the yield and economic aspect of the system dynamic model in more detail. And here we see more in detail how sea level, hydropower capacity and cultivated area affect each other. And for the last part, we see how we simulate the river levels and the river discharge and what implications that has on floods. Here are the results for the base case of the simulation. And we can see that yield increases rapidly during the first years, mainly because of good supply of water, which we can see from the flooding factor. Cultivated area and yield peaks in 2017 before they decline due to increasing erosion when dam construction increases and salinity intrusion. From the middle graph, we can see how the costs and profit mainly follows the yield and how the cost of fertilizer increases significantly until the area drops, and the fertilizer cost does that too. Comparing these results with the actual development of yield and cultivated area until 2017, we can see a more rapid increase during the first year in the simulations. Also, the maximum yield and cultivated area occurred in 2014 and 2017, while the simulation shows a peak in 2017. For the scenario and policy analysis, we have 4 different scenarios covering cultivation practice, increased sea level, increased construction rate of hydropower plants, and increased annual rainfall. And here we see the scenario analysis results for cultivated area and yield. And as we can see in the first graph, is the result of introducing triple cropping is that yield increases significantly. And in graph number 2, we can see how increased sea level affects the yield and area negatively after 2015, when the sea level accelerates. In the third graph, we can see that increased construction rate of hydropower plants from 2019 also leads to a larger decrease of planted area. In the fourth graph, we see that increased inflow to the river system boosts the yield, especially during first year of the simulation period and until 2015. Thereafter, we can see that the same decrease in yield and area as for the other scenarios. On this slide, we see how the flooding factor changes for the different scenarios, and a change of cropping practice is not included in this result, as it's assumed not to affect the flood levels. And worth to note is how construction of hydropower substantially decreases water supply in the river, as we see in graph 3, and how increased rainfall increases water level. So there is never water shortage, which we can see as flooding level is over 1 for the whole period in graph 4. If we look at how the costs, revenue and profit changes for the farmers in the different scenarios, we can see that it is the fertilizer cost that changes the most, as other costs and revenue follows the pattern of yield more closely. For triple cropping, the fertilizer costs obviously increases as the number of crops increases. For the sea level scenario, the fertilizer cost also increases as increased sea level leads to increased erosion along the coastline and more crops being destroyed due to increased salinity levels in the water around the plantations. And for the third and fourth scenario, there is no significant change in fertilizer cost.
Finally, we generated our conclusions and provided recommendations according to our project. Firstly, we advise government along Mekong River cooperate with each other to reduce floods caused by dam water releasing from other countries. Secondly, it would be great if we can better flood control and seasonal production planning, because that will lead to a more sustainable use of fertilizer among farmers and putting poor areas at less risk. Thirdly, it is necessary to develop new crops to consumer, less fertilizer, and are more adaptable to drought. Finally, more researches are required in mitigating climate change and also crops that are more adaptable to climate change. This is a sample from one of our recommendations. By developing new types of crops which consume less fertilizer, the power of loop balance 1 and balance 2 can be reduced because of 2 reasons. Farmers will need to use less fertilizer, and thus will be shared of artificial nutrients, of total nutrients decrease. Also, new crops may consume less nutrients from total nutrition. Therefore, in overall, the loop reinforced tool can have more impact on the system and bring more profit to farmers. This is our reference list